Okay, I think, we will make a start now. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you all for coming to this workshop on unlocking financial levers for a local just transition. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Antonia Jennings, and I'm one of the Associate Directors at CLES, which hopefully you do know by now is the Centre for Local Economic Strategies. I'm going to be co-facilitating the session today with my colleague Ellie Radcliffe, who is a Senior Researcher at CLES. It's really wonderful to see so many of you here today, and we're absolutely thrilled to be joined by our three contributors to the session, Dr. Mark Davis, Kate Gilmartin, and Andy Hunt. Before we kick off, I just wanted to run through a couple of housekeeping points. We are going to be recording the session, so if you don't want to be featured in the recording, please keep your microphone and camera off. We do want to hear from you though, so please let us know you're here and where you're from by putting your name and organisational details in the chat. We're using the hashtag CWB Summit on Twitter and would encourage you to use it if you will be tweeting today. And as Sarah said in Monday's opening session, we're asking everyone to reflect throughout the summit on what they're learning and how they can put it into action. So if you do come up with a good what will you do on Monday, make sure you complete the form we're putting in the chat now, and we may call on you in the final session on Friday. So before we move to the speakers' contributions, I wanted to outline why we believe financial levers to enable a local just transition is such an important topic and how CLES is currently understanding the landscape. We'll then move to Ellie, giving an overview of two current experiences of councils before hearing from our expert contributors, after which there'll be a Q&A before we move to a breakout session in which we hope you'll all participate. We're very keen to make this a productive, solutions-focused space that helps us all advance this agenda in our workplaces and communities. So I think the first thing to say is, ultimately, we know that a global response to environmental breakdown is founded on the action and energy of local areas. Local people and local institutions are the ones that are best placed to identify which actions can be taken to tackle the root causes of the crisis, and in doing so, crucially, provides them with agency over the problem. Furthermore, over the last few years in the UK, we've seen many local councils and other anchor institutions have declared a climate emergency. Subsequently, from these declarations of a climate emergency, some local authority plans have emerged. Often, we've seen that these plans have gone above and beyond national targets for mitigation and adaptation, really showing the ambition of regional leaders in addressing this agenda. However, we've also seen within these plans that these are often just a list of policies that could accelerate substitution of dirty for cleaner technologies. Thinking about the just in the just transition is often deprioritised. The broader problem that many of these plans are facing are around acquiring finance for delivery. In our reading of the financial mechanisms currently available, they fall broadly into three camps: funding from national government, the repurposing of funding currently within councils and other anchor institutions, and finally, new financial streams available to local authorities via community or municipal bonds or similar. So let me go through them in a little more detail. So firstly, on funding from national government. At the highest level, we know that there are multiple funds which in theory could support the green transition. Next year, we'll see the Shared Prosperity Fund launched to replace EU structural funds. And of course, we have the long-awaited and much discussed Levelling Up Fund. We've also seen the rise of funds specifically for the green agenda. For example, the £350 million Sustainable Warmth Competition, the £40 million Green Challenge Fund, the Air Quality Grant Programme, and so on. There's also been funding available for other anchor institutions, such as the £800 million Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund. Generally, these funds from national government enable relatively small-scale pilot projects and are not enough to deliver on the government's own environmental targets, let alone the more ambitious ones put forward by councils and other anchor institutions. Second of all, we know that these funds are not likely to significantly increase in size to match the urgency and scale of finance needed. While of course this is a very frustrating situation, we're really keen to focus this session today away from these inadequacies and look to currently available alternatives. So that brings me to the second financial lever, redirecting or flexing existing council and anchor finance. Over the past decade, we've seen great advances in council departments and other anchor institution departments using their budgets to further a local just transition. We've seen procurement teams inbuild green criteria into their contracts, such as the Mayor of London's Green Procurement Code. We've seen economic development teams prioritise decarbonisation of transport, such as Greater Manchester's proposed levelling up deal. And we've seen councils overall experiment with participatory budgeting for the funding of local environmental projects. Of course, that is not anywhere close to the extent of council activities in this area, but a few examples of how existing monies are being flexed to support this agenda. However, as we also all know, flexing existing budgets can only go so far. As we will all be acutely and painfully aware, councils are facing extreme budgetary pressures, with many at risk of bankruptcy. And as demand for council-led services are currently being exacerbated by the pandemic, this urgent social need is being met ahead of longer-term environmental ambitions. So this brings me on to our third financial lever, which will be the focus of the session today: creating and unlocking new revenue streams previously underexploited by local government and other anchor institutions. We would say that there are many that fall under this category. We've seen recently that many ambitious local governments have addressed this urgent financial need by exploring things such as municipal bonds, community benefit bonds, credit union investments, public pension pots, and community energy schemes and similar. And while our expert speakers will outline the contours and opportunities of some of these funds in more detail, I wanted to offer some brief thoughts of the challenges some of these streams encounter, and hopefully some food for thought for our subsequent breakout session. So the first thing to say is that alternative funding streams can offer high levels of community engagement and really ensure that the just within this just transition is democratically defined. And equally, if not more importantly, they can actually provide finance at a time when it's so desperately needed. Furthermore, they can provide a funding stream that sidesteps the requirement of national government funding, enabling local government to deliver bespoke initiatives suited to their community. So the first issue in our reading of it around a lot of these alternative financial levers is around their returns. Currently, many of these bonds offer low returns and therefore to some extent are reliant on goodwill investing. Furthermore, we know that the environmental agenda is very broad, and while returns on certain types of green investments are promising, investment in biodiversity restoration, nature conservation, for example, are relatively low. And there are questions around how communities and local governments value investments further than in monetary terms. Finally, there's a question around whether these financial levers can offer the scale of finance needed. There's little history of local government exploiting these financial streams in this country, and whether they will be able to command the confidence of investors to dramatically increase in size in the timeframe needed is questionable. Municipal bonds, for example, have a long history in the USA and are seen by local investors as a proven, reliable investment. Compare this, for example, to the recent bond launched by Islington Council, which is for just £1 million to assist with Islington's commitment to be net zero by 2030. And as it stands, that bond has only been 36% funded. And to give you some idea, although you will be the experts in this area, of the scale of finance needed, Greenwich has recently costed its roadmap to net zero at £5.8 billion. Furthermore, we know that not all communities' investment abilities are equal. Just as globally, the impact of environmental breakdown in the UK is going to be most badly hit those communities that have the fewest resources available to combat it. Therefore, there are questions around whether communities that need the finance the most are most able to access it. So I'm now going to hand over to Ellie Radcliffe, who will outline some of the challenges that two councils are facing to show these issues in action. Ellie, over to you.
Thanks very much for that introduction, Antonia. Hi, everybody. Thanks very much for joining us. So I'm going to give you a brief overview of the issues two councils are facing. So in preparation for this workshop, we approached two councils to find out what sort of challenges they were coming across in terms of financing climate action locally. And we wanted them to be really candid about their situation, so we're anonymising them. So if I refer to them as Council 1 and Council 2, hopefully you'll know who I mean, but I'll give you a little bit of context as to kind of what their situation is. So Council 1 was a large metropolitan council in a heavily urban area. They have a very dense area. It's got a very large population. And their approach to finance at the moment isn't as advanced in community wealth building terms as the second council we're going to talk about. And I'll give some examples of this second council and the approaches they're already taking a little bit later. So with Council 1, we asked them about a live issue that they're currently facing. And for them, this was finding the finance that they need to fund retrofit across their place, starting with their own housing stock, because they still own a significant proportion of housing stock where they are, but also then thinking about how you roll that out to different forms of tenure across the city. Alongside this, they were doing a lot of thought around making sure that their actions help to build community wealth and deliver a just approach to tackling environmental breakdown. So they shared with us that at the moment, they are establishing an internal team to push their net zero commitments forward. Now, with that, a big challenge that they faced is addressing the competing financial pressures currently within the council at a time when budgets are particularly stretched, and making the argument to prioritise staff resource for their approach to net zero. They have managed to do that, and within that team, they're going to have a dedicated finance and bids officer. But without that internal resource, it is very hard to develop project ideas for new rounds of government funding. It takes a lot of time, a lot of energy, a lot of thought. And I'm sure that's a challenge that many in the room will be familiar with. Government funding as well is also very prescriptive and quite piecemeal in what it will enable councils and different organisations to do, as Antonia mentioned. And this often results in small pilot projects which aren't then backed up with the resource, A, to learn from them and build on any mistakes and kind of make changes to improve things, but also they're not backed up with the resource to apply them at scale. So thinking about this, the council that we spoke to want to go beyond what is available through kind of government opportunities and think more broadly about funding. So at the moment, to finance their efforts around retrofit, they're exploring private finance through a large national bank. But the challenge they're facing there is knowing how to navigate the land of finance and demonstrate their project's investability, because it's not an area that they're familiar with, and it's quite an uncomfortable space to be in when they're used to trying to, navigate the resource that's already in-house or that they've won through bidding rounds. Alongside this, internally, they haven't maximised the potential of partnerships and collaborations within the area that they're working. And this is quite significant because obviously a community wealth building approach in a place advocates for greater collaboration, and there are a lot of strengths to come with that, which I'll explain a little bit more when I talk about the second council. So that's what's going on with the first council, and I'll write a little summary of that in a minute. So the second council that we spoke to was much smaller, in a more rural area with multiple towns within its locality, but it's nowhere near as densely populated. Now, their approach to finance is more developed in a community wealth building sense than the first. So from their perspective, they shared that while they know that revenue is strapped and agree that it's a challenge, in their view, there's a danger of this lack of revenue becoming an excuse for inaction on the climate. So they're already thinking differently about how they use their reserves, their approach to cash flow and risk, and how they use the levers and finance available to them to enable community wealth building and climate action through what already exists. So some quick examples of how they're already doing this, and feel free to ask me questions about this later and I'll give a little bit more detail. They are already working with surrounding local authorities to collaboratively deliver retrofit and support the development of local retrofit supply chains using the £1 billion worth of spend that they're due to spend over the next 30 years on repairs and maintenance to drive the development of local supply chains. And this is all money that will be going into repairs and maintenance on council-owned housing across 7 local authorities, including their own. They're also planning to loan a community energy group £250,000 to support them to get to the development stage of delivering a solar farm locally. And beyond that point, they intend to invest a significant sum alongside community shares to ensure the solar farm stays in public and community ownership as part of their community wealth building approach. Now, in terms of the challenges the second council are facing, they told us that the lack of revenue that they mentioned earlier was a challenge to them because it has a significant impact on officer headspace and their capacity and ability to work creatively around community wealth building and climate. And also alongside this, the lack of resource available to carry out multiple projects at once. So at the moment, because they're quite small and they have limited in-house capacity, that puts a real barrier in place in terms of driving things at the pace that's needed to address climate change. Now, they did also acknowledge that although the mechanisms of public sector finance were a challenge for them, so for example, the minimum revenue provision and some of the lack of flexibilities around how they can use their housing revenue accounts, they did say that there are flexibilities that already exist, which they're not using. Alongside this, they reflected the challenges with government funding that the first council spoke about, and they agreed that where money is made available by the government for particular things, the way it can be won and used is both very short-term and very prescriptive. A key area of finance for them that they wanted to be able to unlock were local pensions, because being able to invest those local pensions into local community projects is a huge missing piece of the jigsaw and something that we've already seen done in Preston. Alongside this, they also explained that it was easier to find or provide finance for climate action which generates revenue or delivers cost savings, for example, community energy projects. Where the council was really struggling was finding funding for projects which don't generate this revenue or savings. For example, actions with more focus on nature and biodiversity. So far, the way that they've raised money for this has been through the sale of a ransom strip of land for a housing development. And they're using that money to implement some work as part of their biodiversity strategy. But obviously, this approach to financing climate action isn't sustainable. We shouldn't be selling off all of our land and property to be able to finance the action that we need to take, which doesn't have an obvious financial benefit. But it is a significant challenge that many councils will be facing. So to summarise and to focus in on kind of three key areas that we hope to dig into with you later in our breakout session, we've picked out some of the key issues. So the main issues both councils were facing to us were making sure that existing funding streams support community wealth building and address local inequalities, accessing or creating alternative sources of finance to support the development of a local just transition, most significantly thinking about the longer term and helping to apply interventions at scale. And finally, how we secure finance for actions to tackle environmental breakdown which have lower monetary returns. So thinking about actions which don't necessarily generate financial income or savings, but may have a very high impact in social and environmental terms. So on that, I'll stop talking and I'll pass back to Antonia to hear from our speakers.
Thanks, Ellie. That was great. So I'm now going to hand over to our first contributor to the session, Dr. Mark Davis. Mark is Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Leeds. Alongside this, he's a member of the advisory group for the Friends Provident Foundation's Fair Economy Grant Programme and Director Bauman Institute Research Centre. He specialises in evaluating the efficacy of sustainable consumption for addressing both financial and climate crises. Among other things, his research, in collaboration with industry and local authorities, has enabled the development of community municipal investments and has contributed to the effective design of prosumer-based models which ensure active participation of citizens in Europe's green energy transition. Mark, over to you.
Thank you. I'll try to live up to that introduction. That was very kind. Thank you. Thanks to Antonia and Ellie. Good afternoon, everyone. In my response for around 10 minutes, I'm going to speak to you about community municipal investments, or CMIs, a new model of alternative finance that provides a practical solution for cash-strapped councils to raise funds for local net zero projects, at the same time as giving local people the opportunity to vote with their money for a fairer, greener future. Now, the UK government's new net zero strategy, Build Back Greener, has set out policy proposals to decarbonise the UK economy by 2050. Whatever we might think of that document, it's clear that delivering green infrastructure projects necessary to meet climate targets will require local authorities to play a leading role. Fortunately, 2/3 of councils have already declared a climate emergency, but they undoubtedly face a major funding crisis limiting their ability to act, which is reflected in Ellie's experience with her 2 case studies. Since 2010, councils have lost on average 60 pence in the pound of central funding under austerity programmes and have now been further hit by the economic impact of the pandemic. Councils also have reduced borrowing options for their capital programmes. Rates for the Public Works Loan Board, or PWLB, have fluctuated, grant income has fallen, and the government finance provider Salix has scrapped its 0% loan offer for energy efficiency measures. Now, it's tempting at this point to descend into a long pessimistic rant for the next 8 minutes about the state of national government policy. Clearly, councils are going to struggle to finance local net zero projects while maintaining frontline services without new sources of stable, low-risk borrowing. But to resist that temptation and offer a more hopeful stance, where can councils turn to secure the funding they need to decarbonise local economies in line with those national proposals? And as citizens, how can we help? Well, enter community municipal investments, or CMIs. In partnership with the crowdfunding platform Abundance Investment and working with the public sector organisation Local Partnerships, my research at Leeds set about finding practical solutions and co-created CMIs to help unlock financial levers for a local just transition. The UK has the most mature alternative finance sector in the world, so I wanted to test whether investment-based crowdfunding could work as a new model of public sector finance. I worked inside 3 NHS bodies and 3 local councils over a period of 18 months and learnt, very similar to Ellie, that any innovative finance options had to match capital and administrative costs for councils due to that lack of headroom and lack of capacity. Okay. We created a new decision tool to guide council teams in evaluating different models of crowdfunding against a range of project delivery and procurement scenarios, and created CMIs with them to provide an opportunity for people to invest directly in local green and social projects. Now, whenever I mention crowdfunding, people immediately think of gift making or donation. So let's start by saying this is backed by a business model that uses debt or equity to provide a meaningful financial return to anyone who decides to invest. With precious central resources rightly protected by councils for staff and frontline services, such as health and social care, CMIs are enabling councils to finance harder to fund net zero projects, including solar panels on schools and council buildings, building wind farms and installing EV charging points, retrofitting social housing to help combat fuel poverty, installing LED lights on local transport routes, right across that spectrum of projects. CMIs are structured as long-term investments, so around 5 years with a fixed repayment. They're issued by council's corporate body via the crowdfunding platform and delivered to market as local climate bonds tied to specific green projects within the council area. From the local authority point of view, borrowing this way is cheaper than the PWLB, although CMIs can be blended with PWLB finance to support larger capital projects. They therefore are intended to provide councils with an alternative to, let's say, being incentivised by government to turn to complex shareholder-facing and often controversial private finance structures that can be frequently misaligned with climate objectives. Now, another major innovation of CMIs is to help de-risk net zero investment by disconnecting retail investor risk from project risk. What that means is in the design stage, we ensured that the risk investors take is that the council somehow ceases to exist and loses its tax raising powers during the 5-year term of that investment. The risk isn't whether an infrastructure project fails. Now, despite real threats to their financial well-being, we know that councils are extremely robust organisations, enjoying an institutional longevity even beyond high street banks, if we think back to what happened after 2008, and yet people still believe banks are the safest place for their money. The return on a CMI is 1% to 1.5%, reflecting that low risk, equivalent to UK gilt markets. And CMIs provide a better rate of return than most people are getting with their high street finance products. A quick glance this morning shows the best rate you can get in high street savings is 0.05% for a product that has absolutely nothing to do with climate objectives. Okay. Now, at the same time, your investment through CMI is helping to deliver more positive social and environmental outcomes because it's transparently linked to a specific net zero project in your local community. Investors can walk, cycle, or catch buses past new solar panels installed on a local school, knowing that it was their money that helped to put them there, whilst receiving an equivalent or better rate of return than they're currently getting on the high street. Councils clearly have a strategic role to play here in deciding where these infrastructure projects are located and therefore who within the community benefits. Whilst we might expect the majority of funds to be raised from wealthier areas within a council's region, councils can ensure that the projects generating the return are located in areas of greatest need and therefore can in some ways help to avoid exaggerating place-based inequalities. That's just one of the ways in which they're aligned with the principles of the European Just Transition Mechanism, which asserts that a healthy economy and a clean environment can and should coexist, but also because CMIs carry a minimum investment threshold of just £5, meaning that as many local people as possible can participate in helping their community to achieve net zero. Now, clearly, any financial return at that level is negligible, but research shows there are tangible co-benefits to participating, such as boosting civic pride and, from the council perspective, improving relations with residents. Now, that might sound good on paper, so it's nice to be able to say that last summer in 2020, 2 councils launched CMIs in very different socioeconomic and political contexts. First, the Conservative-led West Berkshire Council in the southeast, and the second in the Labour-led Warrington Borough Council in the northwest. West Berkshire invited residents to invest over 5 years at 1.2%, hitting their £1 million target 5 days early and attracting 640 investors with 22% of funds from local people. Warrington hit their £1 million target early, attracting 500 investors with an average investment of £2,000 each, and both of those were linked to solar projects. Now, on this point about improving relations and Ellie's point about harder to fund areas of net zero strategy that might not be revenue generating, what's interesting in the West Berkshire case is that 1 in 6 investors in their CMI subsequently decided to donate their first interest payment back to the council for a local biodiversity scheme, namely a rewilding project on local transport routes. Now, from my research, I can tell you at the very start of that process, relations with the council were not in a healthy position whereby donating money to the council was seen as a good idea by local people. Okay, that is the nicest way I can put what I have in interview transcripts. Okay, so we can see how relationships have improved over that short period of time. West Berkshire have since won silver in the Green Public Service Awards and took the Sustainability and Social Value Award at the SIPFA Public Finance Awards for their CMI scheme. Bringing my response to a close, in July this year, the Green Finance Institute launched a national campaign to promote CMIs to all 404 local authorities in the UK, and in the heady excitement around COP26, 9 more councils have now pledged to launch a CMI in the next 18 months. Andy Burnham's newly formed Greater Manchester Retrofitting Task Force is also considering CMIs as part of the financing solution for their decarbonisation strategy for Greater Manchester. Now, that's a whistle-stop tour through around 5 years of my research, but I've been driven to find kind of practical solutions that really do work for everyone in every place, right? Committed to this idea of driving national change through locally based solutions. Yes, we need to green existing finance, but we also need to create new financial channels that allow us to keep wealth within our communities for projects that benefit us. Finally, on the question of scale, because this is quite rightly an issue that comes up with CMIs with this £1 million threshold, our research conservatively estimates that of the UK's 3.3 trillion of investable wealth, which includes pensions, ISAs, financial assets, if we estimate that around 0.25% of that wealth could match the risk return profile of CMIs, so very conservatively, that would still generate a retail market size of around 9 billion for place-based investments into local net zero projects. And CMIs are just one of the options in the alternative finance ecosystem. So many people want to play their part, and now for as little as £5, hopefully CMIs are enabling us to drive change within our communities towards decarbonisation. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark. That was really inspirational, and for 5 years in 10 minutes, comprehensive overview of CMIs. As I mentioned, we're going to be doing a Q&A after all the speakers have spoken, but if you have any questions, do pop them in the chat and I'll be putting them to the speakers at the end. So next we're going to move over to Kate Gilmartin. Kate is the Senior Project Officer for the Rural Community Energy Fund North West and Community Energy Investment Lead at Lancashire County Council. With experience in the direct delivery of community energy projects alongside providing funding, advice and guidance to community groups seeking to establish their own community energy projects, Kate has over 10 years of experience in the renewable energy sector and a well-utilised understanding of the funding landscape for place-based climate action. Kate.
Thanks, Antonia. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for giving me the opportunity to speak today. So unlocking the financial levers for a local just transition. I think we all know that we've got a whole system transformation around low carbon agenda. And I think what we need to focus on is what is the framework for delivery? What are the investment structures that will support that delivery? A large-scale grassroots engagement that's going to enable that delivery, and all the extra capacity and resource which will enable those three things. So we've got a huge task ahead of us. I thought I come from a community energy background, so I thought the best way to describe what I want to do is to do kind of a case study. So I'm going to talk a bit about a project that is in Swaffham Prior in Cambridgeshire, and we're doing a copycat project from Swaffham Prior up in Chipping in Lancashire. Now, this project is originally started with Rural Community Energy Fund feasibility, and it's essentially the village of Swaffham Prior is on oil and they want to move to a low carbon heat solution. They're currently building out at the moment, so we're in the slipstream of their project at Chipping and very much learning from what they did and how they enabled it. And I think what's key is what are the drivers for a project like this? I think we have to really think about the community motivation, and there is huge motivation within communities. I talk to a lot of people from parish councils and they are really worried about climate change. They are motivated around CO2 savings. They're also motivated around energy price volatility and getting left behind. I think getting those people involved is really, really key to how we're going to bring these solutions forward. Collective solutions are going to be a lot cheaper and more efficient. You know, we look at a street by street approach rather than ad hoc solutions. It's going to be bringing everybody along at the same time, which is more equitable. And also, when we're talking to communities like Swaffham Prior and Chipping, we're working with people who are really well respected in their community. So they are trusted messengers. If I go cold to a community, then I'm not a trusted messenger. If people within the parish council are suggesting a scheme, then it's going to get a lot more traction. And I think collective action like this as well means that everyone is getting the information they need and they're keeping up with the discussion. And also it really helps to create a different perspective around new technology. It seemed to be less radical and more the kind of social norm. So this collective community action, I think, is going to be really key to deliver our net zero agenda. So that's kind of the drivers behind communities, but there's huge amounts of additional value that this kind of community action brings. So when we're thinking about this kind of community model, the community generally owns the asset. It depends on the governance structure. At Swaffham Prior, it's going to be a much, it's kind of a joint venture with the county council. Most community schemes that I work on are based around the Community Benefits Society model, which is able to raise finance through the community share issue. And that Community Benefits Society is asset locked. It's not for profit, so any profit goes into a community benefit fund. It's very democratic. You can be a member for £1, or you can can put in £100,000 of shares, which is the maximum, and you'll have equal voting rights. So that is a really great example of community wealth building. And these projects are long-term projects which will generate revenue, either selling heat or electricity. You know, a solar farm, a wind turbine, that's going to be there for 25 years, generating that revenue for the community. So it's a great way of building that kind of community wealth. Research around community projects versus commercial projects, CAG Consulting did a report for Devon County Council, and they suggested that a 5 megawatt solar farm that's built by a commercial outfit as opposed to a community entity, the community entity has a lot more added value. It recycles funding into the local community. So we're talking about different forms of leveraging different types of funding. The Swaffham Prior project is using or wanting to use carbon offsetting fund, and they've been working with Cambridge University Science and Policy Exchange to look at what that mechanism would look like. So essentially it would be getting businesses to purchase carbon offset credits within the Swaffham Prior project, and they think that that can raise the project at over £1 million. Essentially the SMEs that would buy into the project, the enticement is that the sooner you buy in, the cheaper you're buying that ton of carbon, and as carbon becomes more expensive, so the price will go up. So it's a really interesting model that they're looking into. The other thing at Swaffham Prior is fuel poverty alleviation averted. We talk a lot about fuel poverty, but when we're looking at retrofitting, when we're looking at affordable low carbon solutions, we're actually future-proofing our communities against fuel poverty alleviation in later years, especially when we think about the volatile energy markets at the moment. Another way that we're alleviating costs is around grid reinforcements. By doing street-by-street approach, as opposed to ad hoc individual homes potentially getting air source heat pumps, that puts a lot more pressure on the grid. Air source heat pumps are going to be putting their efficiency is much less than a ground source collective scheme. So if a village all goes onto air source heat pumps, the load on the grid is going to be much greater, and that means that the grid will probably need reinforcing. That's incredibly costly, and those costs all go on our bills. Community Energy South did a great project doing a great project called Comuniheat, and that's working with the UK power networks and looking at a village at Barkham and saying to UK power networks, well, how much will it cost you if you have to reinforce the grid, if everybody has an ad hoc approach to getting to low carbon heat? And they said, well, it's going to cost us £10 million. And then they said, well, if it's street by street approach, what's it going to cost you then? And they said, well, £2 million. So that's £8 million of savings that are not put on our bills. But how do we monetize that into project development? Another thing to think about is kind of flexibility around the grid. There's flexibility markets and how we can look at demand side response to actually monetize us being more flexible. And when you think about how we're going to have more microgrids, when we think about vehicle to grid with electric vehicles, there's going to be a lot more need for looking at flexibility and balancing the grid locally. Another factor is also health benefits and NHS costs alleviated. For example, we look at the Swaffham Prior project, we're going to have warmer, healthier homes, better air quality. You know, what's the value from that, and how can we monetize that? So there's huge societal value to be realized, but we're not very good at the moment in the community energy sector at badging that up and putting that in data sets. And I think we need to get stronger on that. I think as far as getting new investment involved, Antonia mentioned the Shared Prosperity Fund. We don't quite know what that's going to look like, but certainly if it's anything like the Community Renewal Fund, it will have kind of cross-cutting agenda of low carbon and social impact. So we're really trying to think about projects that we can bring forward and get ready for the Shared Prosperity Fund, which is in April next year. There are various funds for seed development. I mean, Rural Community Energy Fund that I deliver, it's there for seeding projects, feasibility and development grants. And there are various funds from the National Lottery, from PCAN that will do similar things. But I think the new finance that we need to be looking at, obviously Mark's already talked about the CMIs, the community share issue that I've just mentioned, that's based around the Community Benefit Society model. There's also things like Carbon Co-op, they're looking at people-powered retrofit. Again, they're using community share issue and people can invest in that and they actually get enterprise investment scheme tax relief as well. I think social return on investment, badging up our projects to show what we're improving and how, using things like the UN Sustainability Development Goals, for example. And also I would certainly recommend looking at the Cambridge University piece of work on carbon offsetting. I think I'm probably overrunning. I just want to say that, you know, how do we get more projects and what about this framework for delivery? I think we should be looking forward to the local area energy plans. They're going to be kind of led by local authorities and distribution network operators, but we've got to get the communities involved as well. Communities can bring huge amounts of expertise. They have the investment, the way to raise investment through community share issue, and a lot of experience in delivering projects as well. The other thing I just wanted to touch on briefly is capacity and resource. Community Energy South very successfully delivered community energy pathways approach, and we're looking to roll that out in the north. With our new way of working, webinars, etc., it's so much easier to support communities through networks, through masterclasses, and also invite the local authority officers along because they can learn so much from this community work. And it's a real kind of meeting in the middle with the local area energy plans in mind. And also we mustn't forget SMEs. They are going to struggle to meet their carbon targets. How can they work with their local communities? Wind turbines, for example, can't go ahead unless they're in the local plan, and that can't happen without community consensus. So how do we get our communities on board, looking together with commercial interests at net zero? I think that's everything. Just to say that communities have a real kind of holistic approach. They don't just think about one thing, look at one project. They're looking across the whole sphere, including climate risks and things like flooding as well. So yes, please engage with your communities and let me know if I can help you with that. Thank you.
Fantastic, thanks, Kate. Really great to hear about some of those community models in action and an incredibly uplifting lens through which to view the community within community wealth building, which I think sometimes is a little overlooked. So last but by certainly no means least, we're going to move over to Andy Hunt. Andy is the Programme Manager for Community Wealth Building at Oldham Council. He has a key role in driving forward Oldham's Green New Deal, and with over 18 years of experience in local government, he has a wealth of knowledge around how to use and flex financial mechanisms to support climate action, and is a partner in the Oldham Energy Futures project. He also had a central role in supporting the development of Oldham Community Power, a local community-owned energy project. Andy, over to you.
Okay, thanks very much, Antonia. And as they say, now for something completely different, well, hopefully not completely different, but a bit of a different take on community wealth building for a just transition. So as Antonia mentioned, I lead Oldham's Green New Deal programme. Now, the Green New Deal, you may or may not be aware, it's basically about using, it's an economic approach as much as it is an environmental approach. It's about using economy to drive climate action. So Oldham's Green New Deal, the strategy was adopted 1 week before the first national lockdown, so it didn't get the best start in life ever. It was at the time the UK's first local authority Green New Deal, and there have been more since, notably London has one. It sets 2 stretching carbon neutrality targets. So for council buildings and street lighting by 2025, and for the borough as a whole by 2030, which I think nobody is under any illusions that that's an extremely challenging target. But the underlying principle really of the Green New Deal is that achievement of these stretching carbon neutrality targets cannot and will not be achieved without harnessing the power of the wider economy, creating jobs and training opportunities in the process. We need to secure the investment to deliver that transition. So the council itself, as we know, has a very small resource to bring to bear. So we need to use that very small resource to pull the very biggest economic levers that we possibly can. I mean, very often the council doesn't even have capacity to carry out any feasibility work on potential projects, let alone provide the finance and the officer resource for delivery and operation and maintenance of low carbon infrastructure. So really we need to think beyond all these traditional sources of funding that we've been used to eking the very most out of. And we need to try and unlock the wealth in the wider economy to achieve net zero. So the question then is, if we're going to try and unlock this wider wealth in the economy, is how do we do this whilst securing community wealth and social value? What we're basically talking about is community wealth building at a kind of macroeconomic level, if you like. Today I'm going to talk about two aspects to how we approach this with Oldham's Green New Deal. Firstly, one of the three pillars of the Green New Deal strategy, if you like, is growing the green economy in Oldham. The other two, if you're interested, are low carbon infrastructure and Northern Routes, which is a very large, very specific project to create an eco park in Oldham. But growing the green economy is one of the three pillars. What we're trying to do is to create a green business community in Oldham. So we want to create a self-supporting business community that can support the wider economy to decarbonise as well. So we secured some money from an Interreg Europe, an EU project called Foundation. So this Foundation project, when it was conceived, was originally meant to tackle economic regeneration in areas that had lost a large employer. And Oldham was one of these areas. But more recently, it's been kind of retooled, if you like, to focus on the economic recovery from COVID-19. So we got £30,000 from the Foundation project, and we've appointed some consultants to produce a SWOT analysis and an action plan for the green technology and services sector in Oldham. So the first step in this study is to identify what green businesses we actually have, because we don't know, who's out there. And from that, we can create this green business community in Oldham. We need to interview all of these businesses, along with key anchor organisations, stakeholders, to prepare the SWOT analysis and the action plan. So the action plan will be co-produced, not only with the traditional anchor organisations in Oldham, but also with these individual green sector businesses. And of course, they'll involve key stakeholders such as Oldham College. And the idea that this co-produced action plan, it will contain actions for everybody. And the aim is to harness investment by the green business sector themselves to grow their businesses through the implementation of enabling measures. So we want to enable this sector, remove barriers, put in place opportunities and build confidence in this sector, and also match up suppliers, these green sector companies, with potential customers in the borough. So our hope in doing this is that this will create jobs and training opportunities in the green business sector through these companies' investment, whilst also protecting jobs in non-green businesses, if you like, by helping the wider economy become more competitive, by decarbonising their operations, streamlining their operations, just helping the wider economy to become more green, more energy efficient, more resource efficient. By supplying these goods and services from our green technology and services sector. So what we've essentially got is a circular economic model, which for me is really the essence of community wealth building. It's, you know, it's about keeping that value low, making sure that it's local businesses, local residents that actually get the benefit of this economic activity. We will, of course, ensure that organisations such as the college are providing the right training courses to meet the demand of the expanding sector. And we also want to make sure that the procurement services in large anchor organisations are aware of these local green sector companies who could bid for contracts of that nature. So that's one aspect of how we're addressing community wealth building at a macroeconomic level through the Green New Deal. Now, our second idea, we're exploring the potential for a, I suppose what we call it a strategic investment partnership. And this is all about securing investment and social value from the private sector at a very large scale. So the kind of companies that we're talking about here when we're talking about strategic private sector involvement are large energy infrastructure companies, very large companies. We're talking about your energies of this world, UK Power Networks, Scottish and Southern Energy, not energy supply companies, but energy infrastructure providers. So Kate mentioned the work that's going on in various quarters around producing local area energy plans. So there are some of these plans being produced for Greater Manchester councils, and Oldham's has recently been completed. This local area energy plan shows basically to get Oldham Borough to net zero will require £5.5 billion worth of investment in low carbon infrastructure. And we're talking everything here, you know, we're talking heat pumps, solar farms, district heat networks, electric vehicle charging facilities, you name it, right across the spectrum. You know, the system change that will have to occur to get us to net zero is going to cost £5.5 billion, basically. Now, you know, this could be seen as an enormous challenge, and of course it is, but it's also an enormous business opportunity for these types of companies, these big infrastructure companies. And it's very likely that these companies will try and get, you know, try and get a slice of this business with or without coordination with the council. But what these companies are really looking for is legitimacy in the eyes of, you know, consumers, you know, residents, businesses. And the reason for that is that legitimacy brings a long-term stability for planning, for developing, delivering these large infrastructure projects. You know, these companies have to put a lot of money into feasibility, design, and investment in developing these projects. And what they need is a stable market to do that in. So this is something that a council could offer to one of these companies through a strategic arrangement. Then you know, the council could provide coordination with things like regeneration programs, highways, you name it, everything that the council is doing in terms of strategic regeneration of the borough. One of these companies could be included in those programs. So they're looking for that kind of engagement. Now, this arrangement would be governed by a contract between the council and the infrastructure provider. No investment from the council would be required necessarily, but the council could invest where it chose to in certain projects which could generate an income for the council. And I think it's this contract that's the key thing, because although the council wouldn't have to spend any money to get this investment, it would have to put effort into getting the contract right. And this is where we could get social value out of such an arrangement. So instead of just letting these companies do what they want, if there's a contract there, then we can secure social value via what we call themes, outcomes and measures. So the council has these set of TOMs which govern how we get social value out of contracts. Now, there are obviously risks and benefits to both sides in such an arrangement, but these would be managed within the contract. But the basic idea is that through the contract, the infrastructure provider could subcontract the work to Oldham companies wherever possible fund apprenticeships and other upskilling programs via these social value contract clauses. So, you know, we get the investment in at that macro level, and when it's spent on our net zero transition, that spend would go to Oldham companies, Oldham residents, Oldham training institutions. And just as a last note on this, our ultimate ambition is to set up what we call a local energy market. So there is technology emerging which can enable this. Basically, the idea is that residents and businesses would be able to generate energy and sell it to you know, local residents and businesses. So locally generated energy could be purchased directly by people in Oldham without the need to go through a traditional energy supply company. So all of the investment in, say, solar farms that this infrastructure company could bring, we just, in the contract, it would say that this has to be supplied via a local energy market. And this basically removes the link between the price of energy and the wholesale market, which is driven by the international price of gas. And again, this is about that circular economic model. It's about keeping value local, making sure the investment in energy infrastructure directly benefits residents and businesses in terms of low energy prices. So I'm going to stop there. That's basically it. That's our approach to macroeconomic community wealth building through Oldham's Green New Deal.
Thanks, Andy. Another fantastic contribution, and really great to hear what a pioneering local authority can do in this space. And I think really important as well to stress the point that this is a business opportunity. It is not a long list of costs. So that's great. We're going to move to the Q&A now. So please do post your questions in the chat and I'll be relaying them to speakers. So first, to kick off, we've got a question from Sarah to Mark. You mentioned working with 3 NHS trusts. How do CMIs work in the NHS? Do you have examples?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Sarah. The short answer, I'm afraid, is that they don't currently. So we worked with Royal Devon and Exeter. We worked with Dudley Clinical Care Commissioning Group and also with King's College in London. And I think part of the challenge, well, obviously to do with the borrowing restrictions on NHS, so there's a tie to GDP there that makes it slightly different in terms of their borrowing raising rules, which is a considerable challenge, but also the scale of ambition for our partners in the pilot stage was quite significant. So to give you one example, King's College were looking at a new 30 million haematology unit. And given this was a new form of finance, the scale of that at the outset was just seemed to be kind of beyond what the model could kind of stress test at that stage. What I'm keen to do in future projects is to kind of revisit this and work out whether or not there are ways of NHS bodies or CCGs being part of groups to deliver other forms of local community beneficial infrastructure. But at the moment, we don't have any data on how this works within the NHS. It was fascinating to kind of go through, but that's kind of for future work, I'm afraid, at the moment.
Great, thanks, Mark. And the questions come from Rowan for Andy. Have you given much thought to how you monitor social value contract clauses being carried out? I know in Manchester Council, a lot of developers get away with not completing the elements they have promised to provide as part of winning the development bids. So wondering if you've thought about checks and balances in relation to this.
Yes. Yeah, so sorry, Zoom's a bit glitchy at mine, sorry. Yeah, so no, that's it's a really good point, Rowan. And of course, it's all about contract management. You know, you have the best contracts in the world in place, but if it's not managed and and the benefits actually tracked, then it's not worth the paper it's written on. So, I mean, I mentioned we've got this in terms of capturing social value. We work through the social value portal, who are an organisation who've set us up with a procurement system that uses these TOMs that I mentioned, these themes, outcomes and measures. And we've got about 3 or 4 sets of these TOMs. One set of TOMs is around the Green New Deal. So, I mean, it includes all sorts of stuff, like carbon reduction, biodiversity enhancement, it's sort of the range of measures that you could easily guess. But another set of TOMs that isn't specifically related to the Green New Deal is around what we call inclusive economy TOMs. So, this is about, jobs, training opportunities, all the rest of it. And so the contract that we would have with this infrastructure provider would set out in the beginning a load of measurables, basically, that we could capture and track them on. Now, the other thing, because of course there's very limited capacity within the council to do that, so we would have to track that at quite a high level, basically managing the contract with the infrastructure provider. But we foresee that it wouldn't just be like one big company doing this. The one big company might be the main, there'd be the company that the council would have the contract with, but they would subcontract a lot of it, hopefully to Oldham businesses. So we would actually put a lot of the onus of contract management of those onto them, if you see what I mean. So, part of the big contract would be the contract management of the smaller contracts. We would have to get their capacity to do that. So yeah, no, it's a really good question, and I don't pretend that that the answer's easy, but that's how we would have to do it.
Thanks, Andy. And yeah, you're definitely, as someone that works with many councils, you're not alone in facing that challenge. So we've got a question for Kate from Rachel. You mentioned the importance of community consent. I was wondering if you were seeing a greater willingness to accept wind and solar farms, which may have met resistance previously, particularly if they bring local benefit.
Hi, yeah, absolutely. I usually don't talk to people about wind because historically it's been quite divisive, but increasingly parish councils are pulling me up on that. And I do a presentation to look at different options in their area and miss off wind. And they're now saying, well, what about wind? It's really windy here. There's some really good projects. There's one at Bishop's Castle, and they're looking at one megawatt wind turbine, which will actually have a private wire or direct cable to an energy centre, which will be upgrading ground heat to heating, temperature heat for a community heat scheme. So that's a really great combination. And if it's a community owned asset and people know that their heating is getting subsidised, then I think there's a big shift towards people accepting things like that now. And also I say to people, wind turbines, they're impermanent structures. We just need them there for 30 years, and in 30 years, hopefully we'll have a very different energy system. We'll have met our net zero ambition, and actually those wind turbines can come down. And somebody from the local community shipping said to me, well, I suppose, I'm 75 and I've enjoyed the view for all this time. And actually the next generation, they need to enjoy the view at a future date. So yeah, maybe I might lose my view for 30 years, but so be it. So I thought that was a really refreshing take on what it means to have a view in our landscape.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Kate. So another question's come from Anthony to Mark. What could make a CMI not suitable for a particular investment?
Sorry, what could make a CMI not suitable in respect of what of the council's position or the investor's position? Sorry, would Anthony just elaborate a little on that? That would be.
Anthony, yeah, if you're here, please do.
Sorry, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I don't want to be I don't want to be irrelevant either.
No, it's fine. It was just prompted by your comment that Andy Burnham and Manchester were considering CMIs, and it just made me wonder why it might not be a good option for them.
Yeah, okay, yeah, in that context, yes. I mean, I think it's a great option for them. I think the last I heard specifically, I guess the question is just at the moment around the scale that the model can deliver. So when they're looking at Greater Manchester as an entire region and their kind of retrofitting strategy, at the moment, obviously, the success of the CMI has been at around 1 million, and scaling that to what would be required across Greater Manchester. I think CMIs are seen as being part of kind of finance solution there, rather than being the the whole delivery model. But yeah, as far as I understand, there's no barrier to the CMI as a structure. It's just whether the scale's feasible at this stage.
Great. Andy, there's another question from Rowan for you. Rowan, would love to hear more about what you mentioned right at the end of your contribution about getting rid of supply companies.
Yeah, so this is my favourite subject, this. It's the idea of creating a local energy market. So there are now companies out there that will offer a what they call a local energy market platform. And to cut a very long story short, it's a bit of software that enables producers and consumers on a local basis to buy and sell energy without the need for a traditional energy supply company. So it's kind of, I suppose it's the equivalent of you go into Asda and there's some automated tills, and that means that the supermarket doesn't have to pay anybody to be on the tills, so you get your food a bit cheaper. It's that sort of thing. It's this sort of, they've automated the process of an energy supply company, which is no mean feat. And they're getting it to the stage where say if we were to, we're our infrastructure provider, whoever it is, that they build a solar farm in Oldham, but we can specify through the contract that the energy that feeds into the grid, instead of that, going to one of the major energy companies, via such standard export PPA, it goes into this local energy market, and it can be bought directly by Oldham businesses and residents. This is basically, it splits off this local energy market from the wholesale energy market. So the wholesale energy market is largely driven by the price of imported gas, which is just going up and up and up. But a local energy market, the cost of the energy, the price of the energy, is just determined by the cost of the infrastructure. So once the solar farm's been built, we know how much it costs to produce a unit of energy from that solar farm. That's not going to go up or down. It's built, it's generating energy. And so if you can, as a local resident, I can buy my energy from that solar farm, I know that my energy cost isn't going to go up. So that's the basic principle. But I hasten to add that this is very new technology, and unlike what Mark and Kate have spoken about, we know that CMIs work, we know that community energy works, but I'm afraid we don't yet know that Oldham's approach to these things is definitely going to work. So it's kind of theoretical at the moment. I'm very hopeful, but of course I would say that, I'm very enthusiastic about these new developments, but it does remain to be seen,
Right. Thanks, Andy. I think you've got every reason to be hopeful. So just before we move to breakouts, I'm just going to put one question to Kate, if that's okay. You mentioned the importance of getting community champions or sort of trusted messengers within communities to advocate for these projects. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about your experience doing that. I know it's something that many local authorities struggle with, and where there are initiatives to do it, they only get a certain type of demographic from the community coming forward. So I was just wondering if you could talk a bit more about your experience.
Yeah, thanks, Antonia. I mean, certainly, different demographics have different requirements, have different starting points, have different interests. So historically, community energy was very kind of white middle class, lots of retired engineers deciding they want to do hydro turbine on their weir, and they had that skill set. And what we've done as a community energy sector is try and make sure we're working with lots of different communities. So, I mean, one of the projects which is going on in Oldham, which is a carbon co-op project called Oldham Energy Futures, and it's kind of a counterbalance for the high level local area energy plan that's been going on. Carbon co-ops said, well, actually we've got to engage communities, and actually ask them what they want. And what the way I work with communities, and Andy Hemp was in the workshop the other day, and we were kind of reiterating that actually what we want from communities is their expertise around who and how they talk to their community, what is the vision for their community. And I try and say to those communities, look, we'll take care of the technical stuff, you know, that's what the fund's there for, to pay people to do the technical stuff. We want you to be experts in what it is your community wants, what is the vision for your community. So that's how we try and spread that community energy message, and then it's not dependent on a certain engineering skill set and background. So I think that's kind of a key part in how we get community energy to proliferate. We don't want to make it a certain demographic. It has to kind of reach everybody.
Yeah, thanks. That makes a lot of sense. Ellie, did you also have a question?
Yeah, Kate, so I have another question for you. And we'll see if anything else comes through. But one thing that's really interesting, I think, about the role that you're in is that you're working directly with communities, but you're also situated within the council in Lancashire. And it would be interesting to know how best you think councils can support or enable communities to take those steps to drive things from the ground up. Yeah, any thoughts around that?
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, my role's across the Northwest, and I heavily support communities. You know, we've got RSEF officers regionally, and I often find that local authorities don't have that link with their communities because of resource issues, etc. So what we're trying to do more of is to create peer networks. So they're kind of instigated by people like me, but we use peer-to-peer support between community energy groups. So, you know, we've got a great access to webinars and to Teams and Zoom and all that kind of stuff, but actually helping people to get the support they need from other communities rather than relying on external resource from local authorities. The networks we do want to set up, we also want to encourage local authority officers to participate in as well, because I think there is a massive knowledge gap there as well. So once they see what community energy is, what the mechanisms are for actually delivering and enabling community projects, how we do community share issue, etc., that's a big bit of knowledge that they can then take away and work across their different areas in as well. So Community Energy South have done it really, really well. They started with their peer mentorship project back in 2012. And from that work, they developed the Community Energy South umbrella, which is an umbrella organisation for lots of different community energy groups. Essex County Council have put a lot of funding into helping Community Energy South deliver their community energy pathways. And in the North, we want to get on that bandwagon a bit better.
Great, thank you. I'm totally mindful of time, so I'm going to move to the breakout sessions. So we're going to divide you into 3 groups at random, and we've got 4 questions to guide the next 25 minutes or so. But do feel free to bring up anything you think of relevance that doesn't fall under those 4 questions. But we'll post the questions in the chat. But just to run through them now, first question is, what has resonated with you from what you've heard today from the speakers? And are there any other examples of good practice you know of or are involved in? And then thinking about the 4 specific challenges coming from councils that we spoke to, so that Ellie outlined at the beginning of the session today. How should the community wealth building best tackle them? And just to give you a reminder of what those 4 specific challenges were, they were firstly around the ability to make sure that existing funding streams support community wealth building and address local inequalities. Secondly, the ability to access or create alternative sources of finance to support the development of a local just transition, most significantly longer term to help apply interventions at scale, for example, around retrofit. And finally, the ability to secure finance for elements of environmental breakdown which have lower monetary returns. And then the final question is, as a community committed to local just transitions, how can we best work together to accelerate this agenda? So in that question, we really want to unpack whether there is space for networks or best practice groups to be established, and whether CLES could help facilitate them as well. So I'll leave it there. Questions are in the chat, and we'll regroup it around 22, 1:45. And just to give you a heads up, I am going to ask for a volunteer from each group to feed back to the wider group of us. So do decide who that's going to be. Thanks. Well, I hope you enjoyed that breakout session, got the creative juices flowing, perhaps some new partnerships started to be formed. I'm going to go around the groups and ask for someone, your nominated person, to feed back to the wider team. Despite my best efforts, I was in group 1 and my nominated person was me. So I'm just going to quickly go over what we talked about in the first breakout group, and then I'll move to breakout group 2. So I think the first thing that really came through was just how inspired people were by how much is already going on. And there was really a discussion around how we can mobilize that energy and also broadcast it wider than our community to let more communities, but also governments know, local, and national. Second point was around the fact that there is a huge untapped demand for a lot of these types of investments, and there are so many people who want to invest in local green projects, so we shouldn't perhaps be too focused or worried about that. And then we had a good discussion around also communicating what is happening to build confidence in this sort of market space, if you want to call it that, and perhaps exploring the possibility of a platform or similar through which to broadcast case studies, or perhaps some work around media and communications to get this message out further. What else is in my notes? Yeah, we talked a little about the fact that when it comes to nature and biodiversity conservation and restoration, it is much harder where there isn't such an obvious product or technology involved to monetize the value of that work. And so we talked about perhaps the inevitable slide towards natural capital markets and how local authorities and other anchor institutions should respond. And then finally, we also touched on the need for proper evaluation of the co-benefits that come from this work. Obviously, a lot of this work that comes under a local just transition impacts health and well-being, but also crime, jobs. There's a huge plethora of impacts that it has, and how do we properly capture them and also communicate them to the many departments in which, they have an interest and are directly or indirectly involved. Okay, that's enough from me. Does someone from group 2 want to feedback?
Khalil, I think that's you.
Yeah, that's our group. Okay, great. Yeah, so Rowan was saying that she's very excited by everything community-led, interested in the idea of getting rid of supply companies, that's kind of a radical demand that's been spoken about by energy democracy groups, and that could be an interesting avenue. I think Andy later said that he talked to anyone who was interested, but it's also quite in its infancy as an idea, so there might not be a huge amount of literature on that online. If you're looking for it, maybe just Google local energy markets. Fi, not sure which, who's from Community Energy Scotland, was talking about the responsibility that's on local groups and that's on them to kind of have the expertise to set up local energy initiatives that they may not have, that it's a lot of pressure on them. They've kind of got questions of, should things be outsourced? Should you look for grants? And Andy was saying that that the community shouldn't have to need to know all the ins and outs of the technicals, that Kate can help as a technical consultant to give the necessary expertise. That the local energy market can really boost community energy by feeding into the grid. Now you kind of get a low price for your export, whereas with a local energy exchange you can get much better prices, and he said he'd field inquiries about that. That's Andy. Chris is the director of regeneration on the Isle of Wight, was excited by the CMIs that Mark was talking about, and surprised that the take-up was low on the instrument so far, although Rachel was later saying that I think it's Islington launched one 2 weeks ago, and it's 48% funded. I might have misheard, maybe it wasn't Islington. Andy then was talking about LGA jobs, which I think is something you can look at online, which will show you the number of jobs in a particular community. And you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but this is the gist, required to reach net zero in a community. And then Luke Fraser from the Orkney Islands had a load of interesting stuff to say. They've got wind turbines, farms, tidal generation. They generate close to 100% of their energy demand, actually so much that the grid can't cope. They're too successful. They have issues with regulations that are holding them back, but I didn't quite fully get exactly what the regulation issue was to explain it well here. Nearly done now. People don't want new insulation. It's too much hassle. Luke was feeling like he's not a good salesperson because he can't sell people on 20 grand of free work. Nearly there. Rachel talking about how problematic fragmented funding streams are because of the amount of time and resource everyone is spending on filling out all these forms for small bits of money from here, there, and everywhere. And he was talking about how can you fund these things. Some councils are looking at a thing called biodiversity net gain, which I think is like a program where if you don't want to do something, you pay into a pot that can be used for stuff like rewilding. But again, I might have misunderstood that, and that the other way to pay for it is putting social value clauses in contracts. Victoria was interested in the excessive energy created in Orkney because she's from Manchester, and it was mind-blowing to her. And what can you do with the extra energy? Luke was like, we've created hydrogen vans, ferries, testing hydrogen aircraft, electric aircraft. They've got the highest or close to the highest electric vehicle uptake in the country, looking at ammonia for shipping fuels. They've got 250 ships coming in next year. And Fi was saying that mainland communities are behind the islands because the islands had to adapt quicker because of the cost of fuel for them. And sorry if I missed anything, that's pretty much all we've got.
All right, sounds like a really wide-ranging discussion. Thanks, Khalil. Is there anyone from Group 3 that wanted to feedback?
I think that was us. Was that us? Yes. Great. Yep, it's me, Antonia. So, yeah, we had a really interesting discussion. I spent a bit of time sort of unpacking things around the CMIs versus crowdfunding, reward-based funding methods. And so we talked quite a lot around how to build something which increases sort of involvement of people in these and kind of democratic engagement, and then what are the kind of potential need for trade-offs there in terms of inclusion and making sure that you're not, as we we're all very familiar with the kind of pattern of kind of well-resourced places and communities being ahead of the curve on lots of this stuff, and the key role for local authorities in sort of balancing out where resources are directed, and the strength of CMIs in that, but the kind of also the kind of value of having more community driven, perhaps reward based approaches. So we sort of tossed that around quite a lot. We also talked, I thought, interestingly about the Mark was saying, one of the things about CMIs is it kind of, beyond the direct investment, gets people thinking about where they're in a retail banking market, like where are you directing your money, and how does that perhaps change how you think about your bank, and how assertive you might be as a customer to your bank, going, actually, look, I can now put my money into these kinds of investments, or I could go with you guys, and why on earth would I go with you guys, and what's your game in this space? So that was really interesting in that much wider question about the financial services and how they operate. Another big theme that we talked about was scale, and lots of reflections on kind of different approaches to scale. So everyone understands we need to do a lot of this stuff, but there was a real kind of resistance to the idea that kind of growing single solutions and replicable solutions was kind of a good idea, and actually the kind of repeatable as opposed to replicable, kind of like how could you seed lots and lots and lots of small things and that be your route to kind of getting scale rather than monolithic schemes. And it felt to me like that also led into a bit of a discussion about the which again resonates with the panel discussion about the place of place-based working in this, and how that kind of real connection to place, and you were talking about, Kate, with you know, that people sort of beginning to connect together and see how their place could be different, and that then you start to grow something specific to your place that people feel a higher degree of ownership of. And we tossed around the kind of, well, where does that scale best sit? Do you go with kind of really hyper local, or is it kind of a local authority level? And there's like lots of different senses of how strong place bonds feel for local authorities even, and then what's the place of kind of regions in some of that. So really interesting to think about that kind of social connection to place, and then the sort of finance scale mapped against that. Yeah, that was a really interesting theme of the discussion. And then we got on to, well, what are the other ways that you could lever in sort of finance to these schemes? So we also talked about social value quite a lot. Matt Jackson made a strong case, I think, for let's just move on from the additional 20% weighting, and actually that much of this stuff should be inherent and intrinsic to use Sam's phrase from yesterday's opening panel, inherent and intrinsic to the way people do business. Businesses should create jobs, they should create good jobs, like that shouldn't be an added bonus. So could we move on from that, so that social value is part of everything that local authorities do and other public bodies do, but also that's absolutely the expectation of businesses in your place? And what would a model of economic development that was, you know, 90% focused on working with local SMEs to grow their ethical practice in that way, and put this stuff right at the heart of how they operate, and for environmental sustainability to be absolutely sort of bolted into that? So the next generation, if you like, of kind of work around social value that goes far beyond something special you do when you're running a procurement exercise. And then we got into we're just starting to get into this at the end, but what's the role of big public institutions in kind of using their scale to really kind of jumpstart a market in place and hubs for development of particular kinds of businesses? So we talked about Lewis and what they're doing around modular housing, and how they're using not just their spending on retrofit of their council home, of house building, but the spending of other East Sussex councils to take a very small modular housing developer and to really give them access to a big market, which takes some of the risk out of it for them. So yeah, that was really interesting. And then last thing was that people were really interested in how to make connections and share information about case studies, and to build kind of progressive alliances. So, you know, us, the donut economics gang, thinking about the UCL lot, how do we kind of make sure that whichever route you get in, that you kind of the whole world is opened up to some of that work? So that was kind of, that got a lot of support. Anyone else from Group 3 want to add in anything there?
I think in the essence of time, but unfortunately going to have to wrap up. It's been an absolutely fantastic session. Thank you so much for coming and participating. I've found it very inspiring and informative to find, you know, so much work in this space going on. And I think, you know, the range of discussion that we've had in the breakout group just shows the depth and importance of this issue. And it also shows, you know, the extent to which stuff can happen in spite of national policy. And I would even go further and say that, you know, building the evidence base for what we've been talking about today only makes change in national policy more likely. So that's really, really been inspiring to hear. Finally, I just, of course, wanted to thank our 3 excellent contributors, Dr. Mark Davis, Kate Gilmartin, and Andy Hunt. You've all been fantastic. And for the event and the summit overall, I wanted to thank our partners, Barrow Cadbury Trust, Democracy Collaborative, and Power to Change, without which this event wouldn't be possible. A final reminder that if you have thought of a good thing for what you can do on Monday, please do complete the form. We're posting it in the chat again in a moment. And this session, as you should be aware, was recorded, and we'll share a link to it in the next week or so. And finally, I'm aware we've hit 4 on the dot. I just want to say that this is a developing area of work for CLES, and if you'd like to find out more about our work or are interested in working with us in this space in the future, please do email myself or Ellie directly, and you can find our 2 latest reports in this space on our website, the Energy Toolkit and Green Recovery for Local Economies. And on that note, thanks again, and hope to see many of you soon.
Thanks, bye.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.